A night in the Middle Ages. Sleep in the Middle Ages was not simply the quiet end of a long day. It was a world of rituals, superstitions, fears, comforts, and customs shaped by a society that understood night very differently from our modern world. Today, we sleep behind locked doors, beneath warm electric lights set dim with a switch, with alarms that wake us and clocks that guide our routines. But in the Middle Ages, the night belonged to something older, something unpredictable, something that felt at times sacred and at other times frightening. To understand how people slept then is to step into a world shaped by candlelight, cold stone walls, straw mattresses, and a profound belief that the darkness carried meaning. A day in medieval life often began before the sun rose. For peasants, the rhythms of work demanded early waking. Fields needed tending, animals needed feeding, tools needed repair. Life depended on labor, and labor depended on the daylight. But nightfall changed everything. When the sun disappeared, the world contracted, the village quieted, the streets emptied, windows closed. Candles were expensive, firewood precious, and the darkness outside felt alive with forces the medieval mind believed could harm the soul as much as the body. For most people, the bedroom was a luxury they did not have. A peasant's home typically consisted of 1 or 2 rooms, with the entire family sleeping in the same space. Privacy, as we imagine it today, did not exist. Parents, children, sometimes servants, and even animals shared one area. The warmth from livestock, goats, sheep, or a cow in the corner helped heat the home during winter. Beds were rare. Most people slept on straw pallets laid over wooden planks or directly on the floor. The straw was replaced when it grew too dirty. Though often it remained for months, collecting dust and sex and moisture, people expected discomfort. It was simply part of life. Yet even in such simplicity, there existed rituals. Before sleeping, families often recited prayers for protection. The night was considered spiritually vulnerable. Dreams were believed to carry messages. Spirits were thought to wander. Evil beings were rumored to roam the forests and fields. Closing one's eyes meant surrendering the senses to a realm beyond control. Protection through prayer was not optional, it was essential. In wealthier homes, the experience of sleep was different. Nobles slept in elevated chambers, separated from the noise and activity of servants. Their beds were built with wooden frames, ropes stretched beneath a mattress for support, and piles of fabric and furs laid above for warmth. These chambers often included heavy curtains around the bed, not simply for decoration but for insulation and privacy. Medieval castles were drafty and cold. The wind seeped through stones. The floor was often chilled even in summer. Curtains acted as a microclimate, trapping the sleeper's body heat and shielding them from drafts. For nobles, sleep was both comfort and status. A finely crafted bed was a symbol of wealth, often passed down through generations. It was not unusual for carvings of mythical creatures or religious symbols to adorn the frame. The bed itself communicated power. Visitors who entered the chamber saw not only craftsmanship but also the elevated living of the household. Sleep, in this sense, became a display of prestige. Despite these differences in comfort, all medieval people shared one common experience: darkness. Artificial light was costly. A single candle might represent hours of labor. Torches smoked. Oil lamps required precious materials. When night arrived, most homes slipped into shadow. Fireplaces glowed faintly, offering limited visibility. The world shrank to a small sphere of dim light. Beyond its boundary lay the unknown. This darkness shaped medieval sleep into a structure unfamiliar to us today. People did not sleep once through the night. Instead, they typically slept in 2 segments: the first sleep and the second sleep. The first sleep began shortly after sunset and lasted for several hours. Then came a period of quiet waking, an hour or 2, when families might pray, talk softly, tend to a child, stoke the fire, or even step outside for air. This interval was considered natural, even healthy. Only after this waking period did people slip back into their second sleep, which lasted until dawn. This rhythm matched the medieval understanding of time, which was not based on clocks but on natural cycles. People accepted that sleep flowed in phases. They believed the waking period between the 2 sleeps had spiritual value. It was a time of reflection, a moment when thoughts drifted more freely, when prayer felt deeper, when silence felt calming rather than empty. Some believed this placed them closer to God. Others felt it allowed dreams to settle and recur. Inside homes, sleep was also shaped by temperature. Winters were brutally cold, and insulation was minimal. People slept fully clothed, often wearing wool garments, caps, and multiple layers of blankets or furs. Families huddled together for warmth. In cold months, beds were warmed by heated stones wrapped in cloth. In summer, windows might be opened, though screens did not exist, and insects filled the night air. Pests were a constant problem. Fleas, lice, and bedbugs infested straw bedding. Wealthy individuals encountered these pests less often, but no one was entirely free from them. The idea of a perfectly clean sleeping environment was unimaginable. Sleep came with discomfort. Waking during the night to scratch or shake out bedding was expected, and yet, sleep in the Middle Ages was not defined only by hardship. It also carried meaning, tradition, and community. Families shared stories before bed, recounting local legends, tales of saints, or events of the day. Children fell asleep listening to their parents whispering by the fire. Couples discussed hopes, fears, and the demands of the morning ahead. In the bed, whatever form it took, was a place where daily life came to a gentle close. The medieval world also saw sleep as a connection to the unseen. Dreams were interpreted as messages from ancestors, warnings from God, or signs of illness. Some dreams were thought to be prophetic. Monks recorded their dreams in journals. Physicians analyzed them to diagnose health. Sleep, in this sense, was both a natural and mystical experience. Nighttime also carried danger. Without modern security, the dark hours left homes vulnerable. Thieves often struck at night. Travel after sunset was rare and discouraged. Roads became treacherous, not only because of criminals, but because supernatural creatures were believed to roam freely after dark. Travelers risked losing their way, encountering wolves, or falling victim to spirits or demons. For many, the safest path was to stay indoors, secure the doors, and keep the fire burning. Because of these fears, the hearth became the center of nighttime life. Its glow offered reassurance. Families believed that as long as the fire lived, they were protected. Before sleeping, they carefully banked the embers, covering them with ash to keep them smoldering. A dying fire signaled vulnerability. A well-tended one offered comfort. Sleeping medieval monasteries followed its own rhythm. Monks observed strict schedules dictated by prayer. They woke multiple times during the night to chant or meditate. Their cots were simple, their rooms austere. Sleep was seen not as a luxury but as a necessity balanced with devotion. Monastic sleep practices influenced wider medieval attitudes about discipline and rest. As the night deepened, the world outside fell silent. Wolves howled in the distance. The wind brushed against wooden shutters. The crackle of the hearth softened. Families drifted through dreams shaped by the rhythms of a life connected to nature, faith, fear, and community. Sleep was not merely rest, it was a journey into darkness that held as much meaning as waking life. By dawn, the second sleep ended naturally. Light seeped through small windows. Birds stirred. Roosters crowed. Families rose together, ready to begin another day molded by survival and routine. The medieval night faded, leaving behind the memory of warmth, breath, and stories shared in the dim glow of the past. Nightfall in a medieval household. When the sun dipped below the horizon in the Middle Ages, life shifted rapidly. Darkness was not just the absence of light, it was a force that shaped behavior, routines, and sleep in ways that feel completely foreign today. Without electricity, without street lamps, without alarm clocks or screens, people experienced night as a distinct world governed by silence, superstition, and nature's rhythms. In most villages and towns, sunset marked the end of public life. Markets closed, taverns quieted, and families retreated indoors. The glow of the hearth became the center of evening existence. For many, this was the only significant source of light. A flickering fire created long shadows that danced along the wooden beams, illuminating the room in uneven patches of warmth and darkness. Medieval homes varied greatly by class, but most common households had a single main room used for everything: cooking, eating, working, gathering, and eventually, sleeping. As night settled, families prepared their sleeping spaces, shifting from daytime tasks to the slow ritual of rest. Beds, if present at all, were valuable possessions often reserved for the head of the household. Many slept on straw pallets, hay-stuffed mattresses, or simple cloths spread across the floor. Linen sheets were rare among peasants, who instead used woolen blankets or fur coverings. The materials were heavy and rough, but kept out the cold that crept into stone walls and wooden floors. Winter nights were especially brutal. Even inside the home, temperatures dropped sharply, making warm bedding essential. Families often slept close together, not just for emotional closeness, but for body heat. A shared sleeping space was a practical survival strategy. Before lying down, most people wound down through simple routines. The final embers of the fire were banked, keeping them glowing through the night. Oil lamps or candles were snuffed out carefully to conserve their precious fuel. Darkness soon reclaimed the household. For those who lived in more spacious homes, additional rooms existed, but the experience remained largely the same: quiet preparation, dim surroundings, and an acceptance that night brought stillness. Superstitions influenced how people approached sleep. Medieval thought framed the night as a time when spirits, demons, and wandering souls were most active. Many believed that letting darkness fill the home invited unwanted forces. Doors were barred, shutters closed, and charms or holy symbols placed near beds. Prayer was an essential part of pre-sleep routine. People asked for protection, guidance, and safe passage through the vulnerable hours when consciousness slipped away. Sleep happened in stages. People did not expect a continuous 8-hour block the way we do today. Instead, They followed a natural rhythm shaped by long darkness and limited stimulation. The first sleep, often called dead sleep, carried people into deep rest shortly after nightfall. It was only later after this deep phase that they would wake naturally for an hour or two. This waking period between first and second sleep was considered normal, not disruptive. People might pray, think quietly, talk with those nearby, tend to the fire, or even step outside to check on animals or the home. In wealthier households, nighttime brought its own rituals. Nobles slept in curtained beds, elevated to provide distance from cold floors and pests. Thick drapes surrounded the sleeping area, creating privacy and warmth. Mattresses were stuffed with feathers rather than straw. Bedding was layered and softer, and servants often slept nearby to assist if needed. Even so, the basic challenges of medieval sleep temperature, darkness, and uncertainty affected everyone. Rooms were not insulated. Cold seeped through stone walls. Wind entered through gaps. Rain tapped against shutters. The night was alive with animal sounds, creaking timbers, and distant activity. People accepted these noises as natural parts of sleep, their bodies accustomed to irregular patterns of rest. In urban areas, sleep carried additional concerns. Cities were crowded, noisy, and active even after sundown. The wealthy guarded their homes carefully. The poor shared cramped quarters. Night watch patrols passed through streets calling the hours, providing reassurance or warning depending on the circumstances. Throughout medieval societies, sleep was intertwined with survival. It was not simply rest, it was vulnerability. People relied on routines, faith, and communal closeness to navigate the hours of darkness. Yet despite these challenges, sleep was valued deeply. Nightfall was a time to restore strength for work, craft, farming, or travel that awaited with the rising sun. As the first stage of sleep settled over households, the Middle Ages transitioned into a world shaped by firelight, instinct, and quiet endurance. But the night was not finished. More lay ahead: rituals, beliefs, and unexpected moments that defined what it truly meant to sleep in a time before modern comfort. Nighttime beliefs, fears, and rituals. Sleep in the Middle Ages was never just a physical act, it was a spiritual event, a moment of vulnerability, and a gateway to the unknown. People believed that when you slept, your soul wandered, your dreams carried messages, and unseen forces could slip into your world. Because of this, nighttime was a period filled with rituals, protections, superstitions, and careful habits meant to guard the sleeper from danger, both real and imagined. Most medieval households ended their evenings by preparing the sleeping space with intention. Before anyone lay down, the fire in the hearth was banked or covered with ash so it would not flare unexpectedly during the night. Darkness in the Middle Ages was not the mild, decorative darkness we know today. It was a heavy, absolute darkness. There were no glowing screens, no streetlights, no polished clocks. Once the fire died down, rooms turned into pitch-black chambers where shadows blended seamlessly into the unknown. Because the night carried its own threats, people developed beliefs about unseen forces that might disturb their sleep. One of the most common fears was the night hag, a supernatural being said to sit on the sleeper's chest, causing nightmares or paralysis. Today we call this sleep paralysis, but medieval people viewed it as a spiritual attack. Many left protective tokens near the bed, small crosses, holy orbs, or pieces of iron, believing they could ward off evil spirits. Dreams were considered messages, often divine or prophetic. The sudden nightmare wasn't merely dismissed, it was interpreted, shared, and sometimes feared. Religious texts described dreams as tests of faith or warnings from God. Folk traditions believed they came from wandering spirits or omens. Because of this, waking up in the middle of the night during segmented sleep often included moments of prayer or reflection, as people tried to understand what their dreams were telling them. Before sleeping, many families performed nightly Christian rituals. They recited prayers like the Ave Maria or the Pater Noster, asking protection for the hours when they could no longer guard themselves. For the wealthy, personal chaplains or servants might stand at the bedside and bless the room before extinguishing candles. For the poor, rituals were simple: a whispered prayer, the sign of the cross, or the hanging of a charm near the bed. Certain herbs were also believed to influence sleep. Lavender, chamomile, and rosemary were used much like they are today, but others like rue mugwort or St. John's wort carried deeper symbolic meaning. Some were thought to protect against witches, demons, or wandering spirits. These herbs might be placed under pillows, hung above doors, or burned in small bundles to cleanse the sleeping area. The fear of nighttime dangers extended beyond the supernatural. Medieval homes were vulnerable to thieves, animals, and even wolves depending on the region. Doors were reinforced, bars were placed across shutters, and bedding was arranged in ways that kept children close to adults. Most people slept fully clothed or partially dressed, ready to respond quickly if danger arose. Even beds for the wealthy were built like small fortresses. Heavy curtains not only kept in warmth but also created a sense of safety, a barrier between the sleeper and the darkness outside. Many also believed that certain sleeping positions offered protection. Sleeping on the back was discouraged. It invited nightmares and made the sleeper vulnerable to the night hag. Side sleeping was considered safer, particularly the right side, which was thought to keep the heart protected and maintain spiritual order. Turning over in bed at night was occasionally accompanied by a brief prayer, a habit taught from childhood. Weather and nature played a huge role in how people slept. In small rural cottages, wind slipping through the wooden beams created eerie sounds, and storms became terrifying events in the absence of modern insulation. Thunder was often interpreted as a divine message or punishment. Rain at night could soothe or frighten depending on beliefs. Some saw it as a blessing, others as a sign that spirits were active. Because people lived so closely with nature, they attributed meaning to nearly every sound the night offered. Animals were another factor. In many homes, especially poorer ones, animals slept indoors: chickens, goats, dogs, and sometimes even livestock. Their movements, noises, and warmth were part of the nighttime environment. Cats were welcome because they hunted mice, but they were also feared by some because of folklore linking them to witchcraft. Still, their presence in the home at night was common. Sleep was influenced by community rituals too. Church bells marked time, occasionally ringing through the night to signal prayers or protect the village spiritually. These bells offered comfort, reminding people that even as they slept, the church stood watch. In the Middle Ages, nighttime was never truly empty. It was filled with beliefs, habits, and small protections that shaped how people slept and how they understood the world. For them, sleep was a delicate balance between rest and vulnerability, a time when forces beyond human control moved freely. The ways people prepared for the night reveal not only how they slept, but how they lived, constantly navigating between fear and faith, darkness and meaning. Nightly rituals, fears, and midnight life as darkness settled over medieval towns and villages. Sleep was not simply the quiet, private act we imagine today. It was a communal experience shaped by fear, habit, religion, superstition, and survival. The Middle Ages understood the night as a world of its own, one that demanded rituals, caution, and faith. For most people, the evening began by securing the home. Doors were barred not with modern locks, but with wooden beams dropped into slots or heavy iron hooks tied with rope. Windows, often simple shutters without glass, were latched from the inside. Families prayed for protection from thieves, wolves, fires, and spirits believed to roam in the dark. Night was considered dangerous. Sleep required preparation. Candles were expensive. Oil lamps created smoke. Torches were a fire hazard. So once supper ended, families relied on a single dim flame or the glow of embers in the hearth. The flickering fire became the center of nighttime life. Children curled near it for warmth. Adults sat close enough to feel heat but far enough to avoid sparks. Shadows moved along the walls, shifting with every breath of wind. Before bed, medieval people performed small routines that varied by region. Some drank warm ale or spiced wine. Others rubbed their feet with animal fat or herbal mixtures to keep warm through the cold night. Those who could afford linen washed their faces with warm water or rose-infused cloths. Farmers checked on animals one last time. Priests recited prayers. Travelers placed knives under their pillows for protection, not against humans, but against demons. They believed haunted, isolated roads. Clothing for sleep was not uniform. Some sleepers wore nothing. Others wrapped themselves in long shirts or layered wool garments. In colder climates, people slept with hats to avoid losing heat. It was common to bring animals inside, especially dogs, goats, even small livestock, because their body heat warmed the home. The smell was intense, but warmth meant survival. Once everyone lay down, the home grew silent except for the constant crackle of burning wood. But sleep itself was rarely silent. Medieval nights were filled with coughing, snoring, shifting bodies, and murmured prayers. In crowded homes, relatives lay so close that one person's movements woke the others. Privacy was nearly non-existent. Children listened to adult conversations. Adults whispered about fears of village news. Couples spoke quietly under shared blankets. In noble houses, servants slept nearby, ready to rise at a moment's call. The night was also shaped by deep-rooted superstitions. Many believed that evil spirits targeted sleepers between midnight and dawn. Witches were said to steal breath, demons to sit on chests, causing nightmares or paralysis. Today we call it sleep paralysis, but medieval people interpreted it through religion and folklore. Some hung protective irbs, rosemary, rue, fennel at the bedside. Others carved symbols on bedposts. In parts of Europe, iron scissors or knives were placed at the foot of the bed to ward off spirits. These rituals were not eccentric. They were a response to fear of the unknown. Despite these beliefs, the night was practical as well. People used the darkness to reflect, pray, or think quietly. In monasteries, monks rose for nighttime prayers, chanting in cold stone halls illuminated by faint candlelight. Town watchmen patrolled streets with lanterns, calling out the hour. Bakers began preparing dough long before sunrise. Blacksmiths stoked their forges. The medieval world did not sleep all at once. Different lives unfolded in different rhythms. Stormy nights were especially tense. Thunder was interpreted as divine anger or omens. Families huddled closer, crossing themselves, whispering charms or psalms. Wind rattled shutters. Animals stirred. Fires needed constant watching to prevent sparks from igniting dry thatch roofs. A sudden blaze could destroy an entire village before dawn. Spring and summer nights were calmer but still busy. In warm weather, some slept outdoors. Shepherds rested under the open sky while guarding their flocks. Travelers slept in fields or by roads, using cloaks as blankets. But even then, rest was light. Thieves, animals, and supernatural fears lingered in the imagination. Inside wealthier households, nighttime rituals were more elaborate. Servants heated bricks wrapped in cloth to warm beds before the lords arrived. Herbal poultices were prepared for aches and pains. Nobles sometimes read by candlelight or listened to musicians playing soft instruments. Scholars studied manuscripts late into the night, their eyes strained by dim light. Physicians recommended warm baths, scented oils, or gentle stretching to promote restful sleep. Yet even they struggled with conditions that scientists today recognize: insomnia, anxiety, sleepwalking, and vivid dreams. Dreams themselves held enormous significance. Medieval thinkers believed dreams carried divine messages or warnings. People recorded dreams, shared them with priests, or searched dream manuals for interpretations. Nightmares were taken seriously sometimes as signs of illness, sometimes as spiritual attacks. A peaceful dream, however, was seen as a blessing. As the hours passed and the household settled, the quiet of the night deepened. But this was merely the first sleep. The medieval world expected to wake up again after several hours long before dawn, long before the modern idea of one unbroken night's rest. Between first and second sleep lay a mysterious interval of wakefulness that would shape their entire night. Night dangers, superstitions, and the fear of darkness. Night in the Middle Ages was not peaceful. It was a period wrapped in fear, ritual, and superstition. For most people, falling asleep was less about comfort and more about survival. Darkness itself was treated as a living threat, an invisible creature capable of slipping beneath the door or crawling across the rafters. People believed the world changed after sunset, that the walls between the natural and supernatural thinned, and that sleep left the body vulnerable to forces no one understood. The night watch existed for a reason. Towns and villages assigned guards not only to deter thieves, but to keep away spirits, witches, and wandering souls. Church bells sometimes rang at midnight to cleanse the darkness, reminding people that even the church took the night seriously. Families whispered prayers before lying down, asking for protection against nightmares that weren't merely dreams. They were considered visits from demons, ghosts, or restless ancestors. In cities, people barricaded their doors with wooden beams. In villages, they pushed heavy chests or benches against the entrance before sleeping. Windows were shut tightly, not for warmth, but to keep out curses, poisons, or the evil eye. Herbs such as rosemary, juniper, and thyme were hung near beds to ward off nocturnal spirits. Even the placement of shoes mattered. Some people turned them to face the door so unwanted entities would be tricked into leaving. Superstition shaped almost every element of sleep. A candle left burning too long was believed to invite misfortune. A mirror uncovered at night could trap wandering souls or attract malevolent ones. Sleeping with your mouth open was dangerous because spirits or demons might slip inside. And dreams themselves were not private. They were interpreted as messages, warnings, or omens. A single nightmare could influence a person's decisions for days. People also feared the returning dead. Medieval Europeans believed strongly in revenants, ghostly figures, or reanimated corpses that roamed at night seeking vengeance. Entire communities reported seeing dead neighbors wandering near graveyards or scratching at windows. The mere possibility kept people awake, listening for unfamiliar sounds in the darkness. Dogs howling, owls screeching, or the wind rattling shutters were interpreted as signs that something unwanted was near. For many families, night was also the time when illness worsened. Fevers rose, breath shortened, and the weak became more fragile in the cold hours before dawn. This added another layer of fear. Sleep felt like surrendering to an unseen force that might not release you. Mothers stayed awake to watch over sick children, and husbands kept one ear open for the sound of intruders or animals approaching the home. Even the layout of a bedroom reflected these fears. Beds were often positioned away from doors or windows. Some people slept with their heads toward the east, believing the rising sun protected the soul. Others avoided sleeping with their feet pointing toward the doorway, fearing that this mimicked the position of the dead during funerals and might invite misfortune. The darkness also amplified the threat of fire. Homes built from timber and thatch could ignite from the smallest spark. A dropped candle, a dying ember, or a knocked-over oil lamp could consume an entire street before dawn. Because of this, families checked the hearth carefully before lying down. They smothered flames, scattered ash, and repeated sayings meant to lock the fire spirit in place. Fire was both essential and feared, a friend in the daylight and a potential killer at night. Midnight wanderers were rare, but those who did walk after dark were avoided. Anyone seen outside at strange hours was suspected of witchcraft, theft, or consorting with demons. Even monks traveling between monasteries preferred to move at dawn rather than risk the dangers of the night. The association between darkness and moral corruption was so strong that the very act of being awake late could stain a person's reputation. Yet despite these fears, people adapted. They found comfort in routine. They knew which sounds were normal and which were signs of danger. They learned to read shadows, to recognize the creaks of their homes, and to distinguish harmless noises from threatening ones. Fear was woven into the experience of sleep, but it did not stop people from resting. They simply slept lightly, cautiously, and with an awareness that the world beyond their walls might not remain silent. Night in the Middle Ages was more than a time for sleep. It was a test of faith, endurance, and superstition. Families huddled together, trusting warmth, prayers, and each other to carry them safely into morning. The darkness was powerful, but dawn was always stronger. And so people endured, night after night, believing that each sunrise was a small victory over the unknown. The night was never truly quiet for people in the Middle Ages. Nighttime was not the peaceful, silent retreat we imagine today. It was a world alive with noises, fears, rituals, and unspoken rules that shaped how people slept, woke, and slept again. Darkness did not offer rest, it offered uncertainty. And sleep, in many ways, was simply an agreement with the night rather than an escape from it. Inside most medieval homes, the night began with a soft crackle of the hearth. The fire was rarely extinguished. Instead, it was banked covered with ash so it smoldered until morning. This was as much about survival as it was about convenience. A home without fire was a home without heat, cooking, or protection. So the last waking act for many families was tending the embers, making sure the flames would not die. The faint orange glow became the night's anchor, illuminating the single room where entire families slept. But outside, the world changed completely. Night transformed villages and towns into unfamiliar, haunted spaces. Streets emptied, market squares darkened, animals quieted. The only sounds came from the wind squeezing through wooden shutters, dogs barking at shadows, or distant hooves on cobblestone. Without streetlights, the dark was absolute, so pitch black that even familiar paths became dangerous. People believed the night belonged to spirits, thieves, wolves, or restless souls. The church bell might ring the night hours, but even that sound felt more like a warning than comfort. Inside the home, sleep was often interrupted by noise: a coughing neighbor, a crying child, a restless animal tied indoors, a drunk wandering outside. All of it echoed through the thin walls. Medieval houses offered little insulation from sound, weather, or strangers. A door was often nothing more than a wooden plank on leather hinges. Privacy didn't exist. Sleep was communal, layered on top of everyday life. In wealthier homes and castles, the night still wasn't quiet, just noisy in different ways. Servants moved through halls carrying candles, stoking fires, or completing late chores. Guards patrolled, armor clinking, boots dragging along stone floors. The constant footsteps reminded residents that danger existed even in luxury. A nobleman's bedroom might sit above a hall where feasting continued late into the night. Laughter, music, arguments, and clattering dishes traveled upward until the candles went out. Even kings rarely slept without disruption. Their chambers were filled with attendants who slept nearby, ready to serve at a moment's notice. No matter the household, night meant vulnerability. People locked doors, not to keep ghosts away, but to keep people out. Thieves favored darkness. Bandits waited for travelers who dared journey after dusk. Wolves prowled fields at the forest's edge. Every sound had meaning. A snapping twig could be a foxer, a threat. A low moan outside could be the wind, someone in pain. Medieval people were experts at interpreting noises because their safety depended on it. And yet, some sounds were comforting. The steady breathing of family members sleeping nearby. The sigh of a neighbor shifting on the straw mattress. The muted whispers of a spouse praying before sleep. Even the occasional rooster crowing at the wrong hour was a reminder that life continued beyond the walls. Human closeness, even in cramped spaces, was often the only protection against the night. But the night held more than noise, it held responsibility. Many people woke naturally around midnight due to segmented sleep. During this waking period, homes stirred softly. Someone might check the fire, someone else might pray, others might talk quietly or tend to children. The night was shared time, a pause before returning to sleep. Outside, night watchmen patrolled towns, sometimes calling out the hour or warning of weather. Midnight and all is well. Their voices pierced the darkness, reassuring some and irritating others. In monasteries, the night was filled with bells, chants, and footsteps. Monks rose to pray long before dawn. The echo of their hymns carried across quiet fields, a lonely but steady rhythm of devotion. Villagers living nearby heard the chants through their windows, a reminder that while they slept, others kept vigilance on their behalf. Even natural sounds shaped medieval sleep. Without modern noise, people heard the world more vividly. Storms rolling in from distant hills, owls hunting, rats scurrying through thatched roofs, insects buzzing in the warm months. Thunder shook wooden beams. Rain leaked through poorly fitted shingles, tapping against buckets placed strategically on the floor. Many people accepted these intrusions as part of life. The weather dictated comfort, and comfort dictated how deeply anyone could sleep. Inside wealthier stone houses, the wind howled through cracks, making eerie tones that blended with the flicker of candles. Shadows danced along walls in unpredictable shapes. Even educated nobles sometimes interpreted these movements as signs, omens, or visitations. The fear of the supernatural was universal. Education didn't erase it, it simply made it more poetic. Despite the noise and uncertainty, medieval people learned to sleep lightly, ready to wake at any sound. Sleep was not a luxury, it was a negotiation between exhaustion and survival. The night remained unpredictable, but over centuries, people adapted to its rhythms, using the sounds around them as guides rather than threats. The medieval night was alive, restless, and always listening. And those who lived through it slept not in silence, but in constant conversation with the world outside their doors. Night terrors, superstitions, and sleeping with fear. Sleep in the Middle Ages was never just sleep. It was a negotiation with darkness, a quiet battle with the unknown, and a nightly ritual shaped by fear, faith, and superstition. Medieval people lived in a world without electricity, without steady light, without any sense of safety after sunset. Night belonged to forces they believed were older than humanity: spirits, demons, wandering souls, creatures of the forest, and omens that slipped between shadows. So every time they lay down to rest, they weren't simply trying to sleep. They were trying to survive until dawn. Church bells signaled the coming of night, but once the sun disappeared, people believed the boundaries between worlds thinned. The living and the dead existed side by side. The fires and hearths dimmed. The wind creaked against wood. The house settled in the cold. Every sound meant something. Every silence meant more. Because of this, people didn't fall asleep casually. Bedtime rituals were closer to protective shields, or before lying down. Many crossed themselves 3 times to ward off nightly demons. Others mumbled charms or prayers meant to protect their souls while their bodies slept. Some placed iron objects, knives, horseshoes, or keys beside their beds because metal was believed to repel evil. Mothers tied red threads around their children's wrists, convinced it protected them from wandering spirits that preyed on the young. Adults tucked blessed herbs into pillows: rosemary for safety, lavender for peace, rue for protection from nightmares. But even with all these rituals, night fear persisted. People in the Middle Ages frequently described the pressing demon, a terrifying experience in which something invisible sat on their chests, choking them, paralyzing them, and whispering in their ears. Today, we call this sleep paralysis. They believed it was a demon, a witch, or sometimes a ghost of someone who died violently. Villagers shared stories of these nightly visitors as if they were weather reports, normal, expected, and uncontrollable. They called it the nightmare, which is where the modern word nightmare comes from. Because of such fear, many refused to sleep, facing open doors or windows. Some turned their shoes upside down before bed to confuse evil spirits. Others slept with heads pointing east because they believed that was the direction of resurrection and safety. People who woke in the middle of the night often stayed still, convinced movement invited attention from something lurking just outside their bed curtains. Bed curtains weren't just decorations, they were protection. Heavy drapes enclosed beds like small forts, blocking drafts, animals, and prying eyes. But more importantly, they created a barrier against the darkness. Inside the curtains, families created a small pocket of warmth, breath, and comfort. Outside the curtains, night swallowed everything. Medieval villagers also believed certain hours of night were more dangerous than others. Midnight was the devil's hour: too silent, too still, too dark. And the time just before dawn was the wolf hour, when animals and spirits were believed to be most active. People who woke during these times sometimes lay frozen in fear, praying quietly until light returned. Then came dreams, often interpreted as signs from God, warnings of illness, messages from the dead, or temptations from demons. Dreams were not taken lightly. A dream of water could mean danger. A dream of fire could mean passion or punishment. A dream of dead relatives meant they were restless and needed prayers. No one woke from a strange dream without thinking it meant something important. Night also revealed dangers that were very real. Homes were built of wood and thatch, which meant fire was a constant threat. Rats crept through sleeping spaces. Wolves howled from forests so near the village you could hear their breath in the wind. Travelers feared thieves and highwaymen who used darkness as their ally. Entire towns locked their gates at dusk. Once closed, No one was allowed in or out until sunrise. So medieval sleep wasn't peaceful or quiet. It was layered with ritual, fear, superstition, and the sense that the night was alive with watching eyes. Yet people managed to rest because life demanded it. Tomorrow meant work, survival, and the struggle of another day. And so they slept, wrapped in heavy blankets, surrounded by bed curtains, whispering protection over themselves and those they loved. The night was not their friend. It was something they endured. The social rules of sleep in the Middle Ages was not simply a biological necessity. It was also a social performance, a public declaration of rank, morality, and identity. The moment a person stepped into their sleeping space, they were stepping into a miniature world defined by etiquette and expectations. Sleeping arrangements reflected status as clearly as clothing or land ownership. Everyone knew their place in the nocturnal hierarchy, and deviating from it could spark rumors, suspicion, or even scandal. For nobles, sleep was staged like theater. Beds were symbols of power, not comfort. A lord's bed was not just for resting. It was for hosting visitors, receiving petitions, and demonstrating wealth through tapestries, feather mattresses, and carved posts. The presence of a bed in the great chamber meant that sleep was always public-facing. A noble rarely slept alone. Servants, companions, children, and sometimes guards slept nearby. Privacy was a luxury no one expected, because privacy itself was considered suspicious. If a person hid their sleeping habits, they might also be hiding their sins. Sharing a bed was normal and not inherently intimate. Travelers shared beds with strangers. Soldiers shared beds with comrades. Monks slept shoulder to shoulder in dormitories. Even married couples were not guaranteed a private chamber unless they were wealthy enough to afford one. In towns and villages, entire families slept in a single room, often in the same bed, positioned like stacked firewood. The rules were simple. Bodies were arranged for warmth and safety, not comfort. No one commented on the closeness because no one had the luxury to question it. Still, social norms shaped who slept where. A guest of honor slept closest to the wall, the safest spot in the bed, while lower status individuals slept on the outside where drafts crept in. In households where servants slept in the same room as their masters, placement was deliberate. Those who needed to wake early slept near the door. Those who were trusted slept closer to valuables. Servants who slept too close to their employers were sometimes accused of impropriety, while those who slept too far risked being seen as unreliable. Even in sleep, reputation mattered. Certain groups had unique sleeping customs. Monks followed rigid rules, sleeping fully clothed and ready to leap into prayer at the sound of the bell. They slept lightly because heavy sleep was considered dangerous to the soul. Nuns arranged themselves in orderly rows, heads covered, bodies restrained under wool blankets. Their sleep was supervised to prevent temptations of the flesh. The medieval belief that dreams reflected moral character meant that sleep itself was monitored. A nun who tossed or whispered in her sleep risked being reprimanded for sin she had not yet committed. Children occupied a strange position in medieval sleep culture. Infants rarely slept alone, not for emotional bonding but for survival. The threat of cold, rats, or malicious spirits made solitary sleep unthinkable. Children slept beside adults until they were physically too large to fit, and even then they often slept at the foot of the family bed. Teenagers transitioning into adulthood were gradually moved to lofts, storage rooms, or shared dormitories, where they learned the rhythms of community rest. No one expected a child to sleep quietly. Snoring, shifting, and talking in dreams were considered typical signs of youthful vitality. Poor families lived within even stricter boundaries. Their sleeping spaces were multi-purpose and constantly occupied. A bed might double as a workbench, dining seat, or birthing platform. Straw bedding was shared among the household and rarely replaced. Sleep was segmented not just by biology but by necessity. A mother might wake to stoke the fire. A father might rise early to begin labor. Children might shift places to escape drafts or pests. The rules were fluid, but the order was clear. Elders took the warmer spots. Infants were sheltered between adults, and animals slept near the humans to add heat. Every decision was practical. Communal sleeping created a different understanding of the body. People accepted the sounds and smells of others. Snoring was normal. Grinding teeth was normal. Even sleep talking was treated more like gossip than a medical concern. A person who revealed secrets in their sleep might find themselves mocked the next day. A person who thrashed might be accused of spiritual unrest. While today's sleep is private, medieval sleep was public evidence of your character. Restlessness could signal guilt or illness. Peaceful sleep meant a peaceful conscience. But for all its structure, medieval sleep also included a surprising degree of flexibility. Families with newborns adjusted immediately. Men working night watches slept during the day. Farmers adapted to the seasons, sleeping earlier in winter and rising earlier in summer. Social rules shaped how people slept together, but real life shaped when they slept. Medieval society accepted that sleep was a vulnerable and unpredictable state. A person might wake to noise, argument, prayer, childbirth, illness, or danger. No one expected perfection. They expected endurance. The social rules of sleep were not enforced through laws but through customs, stories, and expectations. They governed not only where people lay their heads but how they dreamed, how they woke, and how they carried themselves through the night. Sleep revealed who you trusted, who you feared, and who you depended on. It was a reflection of community, hierarchy, and belief. To understand medieval sleep is to understand medieval society itself, a world where every part of life, even the dark hours of rest, was shaped by the constant presence of other people. The night was never silent. If you imagine the Middle Ages as a quiet world where villagers drifted peacefully to sleep under candlelight, you're imagining a fantasy. Medieval nights were alive, sometimes comforting, often terrifying, always unpredictable. People did not sleep in silence. They slept in a world filled with sounds, movements, fears, and an entire rhythm of life that vanished with the modern age. In the medieval night, darkness wasn't just the absence of light. It was a presence of force, something people respected, feared, and adapted to. When the sun went down, the world changed into something almost unrecognizable. Inside homes, the sounds began immediately. Families sharing a single room meant sleep was a communal experience. Parents whispered, infants cried, dogs shuffled, chickens occasionally fluttered from their roost, and older relatives snored loudly beside the fire. Privacy was a luxury no one had. Intimacy, arguments, lullabies, prayers, everything happened within the same few square feet. If someone rolled over or coughed, everyone knew. Outside, the world was even louder. Wolves howled at the edges of villages. Foxes shrieked. Owls screamed in tones that many villagers believed were omens of death. The wind pushed against wooden shutters that rattled like bones. Traveling merchants described the night forests as alive with voices, and for good reason. Every snap of a twig sounded like a thief. Every distant footstep could be a bandit, a spirit, or a neighbor stumbling home from the alehouse. Cities were even noisier. Medieval towns had no noise regulations, no insulation, and no police patrols in the modern sense. Streets echoed with clattering carts, drunken singing, late-night arguments, and the clanging of watchmen ringing bells to mark the passing hours. Cats fought under windows, rats scurried across rooftops. Vendors dumped wastewater into alleys, splashing anyone unlucky enough to be walking below. Church bells were the loudest presence of all. They rang at fixed intervals throughout the night, breaking sleep without apology. Monks relied on bells to structure their prayer cycles, but towns near monasteries had no choice but to share that schedule. A bell at midnight meant matins. A bell at 3 a.m. meant woods. Villagers learned to live with the constant tolling because the church dictated the rhythm of time itself. But the greatest disturbance wasn't noise. It was fear. Medieval people believed the night belonged to forces beyond human control. Demons, witches, restless spirits, and creatures that thrived in darkness were part of daily reality. Many slept with charms under their pillows, iron nails, carved crosses, herbs like rosemary or basil. Others hung amulets above their beds to scare away nightmares, which they saw not as dreams but as literal night spirits pressing on their chests. Doors were barred with heavy wooden beams, not just for safety, but spiritually. A poorly secured door wasn't just an invitation to thieves, it invited evil itself. Sleep paralysis, something we understand medically today, was blamed on night demons. People who woke unable to move swore they were being sat on by witches or drained by wandering spirits. Stories of the nightmare, the origin of the word nightmare, described a creature that entered homes and suffocated sleepers with terrifying illusions. Because of these fears, sleep was often communal for emotional safety. Sharing a room meant sharing courage. A whispered prayer from a mother reassured a child. A fire crackling beside the bed cast just enough light to remind everyone that the darkness outside was held at bay. In wealthier homes, the night had its own rituals. Servants moved quietly through hallways carrying small lamps. Guards patrolled the grounds with torches. Large estates employed night watchers whose entire job was to stay awake, listen for danger, and wake the household if anything seemed off. Even royalty feared the night. Kings and queens slept in guarded chambers, surrounded by attendants who could respond instantly to disturbances. Yet for all its terrors, the medieval night had moments of peace. For many it was the only time the world slowed down. Farmers who labored from dawn until dusk finally rested their aching bodies. Women who spent their days cooking, cleaning, and tending children found a moment of silence. Monks described night prayer as the purest form of devotion, untouched by the distractions of daylight. Even ordinary people sometimes found the dark beautiful. Moonlight on thatched roofs, stars visible without pollution, the crackle of a fire, a spouse breathing softly beside them. A moment to reflect without interruption. But that peacefulness never lasted long. A rooster crowed early. The bell rang again. The village dogs barked at shadows. Someone shifted in the shared bed. The night reminded everyone that sleep was temporary, and dawn always returned with work waiting. The medieval night was not silent. It was alive, chaotic, unsettling, and human, a world where sleep happened in fragments, between fears and prayers, in a dance of darkness and survival. The night that never truly slept. Sleep in the Middle Ages was never a simple surrender to rest. It was a negotiation between fear, faith, exhaustion, and curiosity, an act that felt both necessary and dangerous, comforting and unpredictable. By the end of the medieval period, sleep had become a mirror of society itself, layered, insecure, and shaped by a world constantly shifting beneath it. The wealthy slept surrounded by symbols of status, wrapped in fabrics imported from far-off continents, protected by curtains embroidered with scenes of saints, battles, and family crests. They believed the materials around them could shape their dreams, that the right tapestry could keep nightmares away, or that a fine wool blanket made sleep more honorable. Their chambers smelled of wood smoke, polished brass, lavender, and burning tallow. Servants slept nearby, ready to answer the smallest sound, ready to light candles or summon guards. Even in rest, the rich never truly slept alone. The poor, meanwhile, slept as the earth allowed them to. Straw pallets, wooden planks, shared mattresses, cold floors, and smoke-darkened rafters were their nightly companions. A family might sleep together in a single room, their breath fogging the air in winter, their bodies forming a fragile shield against the cold. Their dreams were shaped by aching muscles, long workdays, and the uncertainty of tomorrow. Yet in many families, despite the hardship, sleep became a communal, comforting, instinctive closeness that bound them together against the world's unpredictability. Across all classes, the practice of segmented sleep remained deeply rooted. People went to bed soon after sundown, slept for a few hours, awoke in darkness, and then returned to bed for a second sleep. The waking period between the two sleeps became a miniature world of its own, a time when secrets were shared, promises made, and fears confronted. Lovers whispered to each other in the darkness. Scholars wrote by flickering candlelight. Parents watched over sick children. Monks prayed. Farmers sharpened tools. Some simply sat still, listening to the silence, waiting for the second wave of sleep to arrive like an old friend. But as medieval society evolved, so too did its relationship with the night. Cities grew louder, streets grew crowded, taverns stayed open later, trade routes stretched farther, religious orders became more structured, their bells dividing the day and interrupting the night. Some people began staying awake longer, pushing their first sleep later into the evening. Others found work that demanded they function during hours once thought unnatural. Slowly, segmented sleep began to erode, reshaped by the pressures of urban life, work schedules, and shifting cultural expectations. By the late Middle Ages, sleep had become a small battlefield of conflicting beliefs. Physicians recommended early rest, warm rooms, and meals timed precisely before bed. Clergy insisted that too much sleep invited sin, laziness, or temptation. Superstitions warned that sleeping with your head facing north invited spirits, that open windows attracted demons, or that certain dreams foretold illness or death. People balanced these warnings with practice. They slept as well as their circumstances allowed, accepting whatever peace the night granted them. Yet for all its rules, fears, and customs, medieval sleep contained moments of surprising gentleness, a mother humming softly to a restless child, a husband and wife sharing warmth under a heavy wool blanket, a servant whispering prayers for the household, a monk closing his eyes after hours of chanting, a traveler finally resting after a long and uncertain road. These small, tender fragments of humanity transcended class, wealth, and superstition. As the medieval world neared its end, sleep slowly slipped away from the tight grip of ritual. Artificial lighting emerged. Clocks became more reliable. Work schedules shifted. And without anyone truly noticing, the ancient rhythm of first and second sleep faded. Night became something different, less structured, less communal, more private, and more fragile. But even now, echoes of medieval sleep remain. The instinct to wake at night, the need for comfort when darkness settles, the strange clarity of thoughts between dreams, the dream shaped by stress, hope, hunger, or faith. The belief that the night is both protection and vulnerability. Medieval people slept in ways that seem foreign today, yet their fears, comforts, and midnight awakenings feel familiar. They slept with the world pressing in on them, its dangers, its expectations, its mysteries. And in doing so, they revealed a timeless truth. Sleep has never been just rest. It has always been a reflection of the life we live, the world we inherit, and the fears we carry quietly into the dark. The night was never truly yours for all the rituals, customs, and routines that shaped medieval sleep. One truth remained constant. The night did not belong to the individual. It belonged to the community, the church, the seasons, and often, to fear. Sleeping in the Middle Ages was not a private retreat but a negotiation with the world outside. Darkness was a force that shaped behavior, beliefs, and survival. Nighttime brought silence, but it also brought uncertainty. Most medieval households slept in communal rooms, not because they preferred togetherness, but because warmth, safety, and survival demanded it. A single fire couldn't heat an entire home. Sleeping separately meant freezing separately. So families huddled in a shared chamber, listening to the crackling of dying embers, the creaking of beams, and occasionally footsteps outside that might not have belonged to a neighbor. Privacy was a luxury only nobles could afford. Even then, their lavish bed curtains embroidered with saints' vines or heraldry were not symbols of elegance alone, but protective barriers. Curtains trapped heat, muffled sound, and created the illusion of a personal world within a shared hall. Inside those fabric walls, nobles whispered secrets, prayed, read letters, or simply tried to forget the weight of the day. Commoners had no such luxury. Their sleep chamber was a tapestry of contradictions, the warmth of bodies pressed together, the smell of hay and wool, and the rustling of livestock stored indoors for protection. A cow's breath might warm the air, while a restless chicken might provide an unexpected midnight alarm. Children sprawled across straw pallets. Parents slept on wooden frames stuffed with whatever materials they could afford, hay, feathers, or rags, and apprentices or visitors simply curled up wherever there was room. The concept of deep, uninterrupted sleep barely existed. Medieval nights were fragmented by necessity. First sleep ended when the fire dimmed, or when someone stirred from cold or discomfort. The house might grow so quiet that even the smallest sound, the settling of wood, a dog barking outside, a code like a warning. People often woke with a sense of awareness sharpened by centuries of inherited caution. In those moments, the darkness felt alive. Outside, the village transformed into a different realm. The streets that bustled during the day became empty corridors lit only by moonlight. The sound of a lone horse or a distant owl carried through the air like an omen. Without modern clocks, people judged time by instinct, by how long the fire had burned, by the chill in the air, or by the shifting glow of the sky beyond the shutters. During this interval, some prayed. Others tended to small tasks, mending a garment, checking animals, stirring embers back to life. Whispered conversations filled the quiet, as if night encouraged truths that daylight couldn't hold. Moments of tenderness, confessions, and quiet thoughts all unfolded in the fragile gap between sleep cycles. Then came the second sleep, slower and deeper, stretching until morning light. But even this final rest was vulnerable. Bandits, wild animals, and fires were constant dangers. Night watchmen patrolled walled towns, calling out the hours, not to reassure those asleep, but to remind them, you are not alone in this darkness. Danger lurks, but so does provision. In cities, curfews dictated when people could move, speak, or gather. The church bells defined the rhythm of night just as they did the days. Monks and nuns rose for vigils, their prayers drifting into the cold air on moonlit cloisters, a reminder that faith never slept, even when the world did. Despite the fear, night held its own beauty. Medieval people described the night sky with stars bright enough to read by. Constellations guiding sailors and farmers alike. The absence of artificial light brought a clarity we can barely imagine now. Children fell asleep beneath stories of spirit saints and constellations. Poets wrote of night as a time for reflection. Lovers stole moments when the world grew quiet. Yet the night remained unpredictable. A knock at the door could signal anything: news of birth, death, danger, or opportunity. A gust of wind against the shutter might be harmless or sinister. People slept lightly not because they wanted to, but because the world required them to. By dawn, the first rays of sun brought more than warmth, they brought relief. The night's trials had passed, the fire could be rebuilt, animals could be fed, fields waited to be worked. Sleep ended abruptly, replaced by the relentless rhythm of labor. Medieval people rarely woke feeling refreshed, they woke feeling simply alive, and in that world, being alive was enough. Night after night, generation after generation, people navigated this delicate balance between vulnerability and resilience. Their sleep was not a break from life, but a continuation of it, shaped by necessity, community, faith, and fear. The medieval night was a world of its own, and sleep was merely a fragile negotiation within it. The night is a living world. In the Middle Ages, nighttime was not an empty silence. It was a living world, one that changed shape the moment the sun disappeared behind the horizon. People did not simply sleep in the medieval night. They navigated it, feared it, respected it, and often surrendered to it. And by the time the night deepened into its coldest hours, sleep was only one part of a much larger ritual of survival and imagination. For many medieval people, darkness was not just an absence of light. It was a presence, something with weight, with personality, almost with intent. In villages, the moment sunset fell, the world transformed into a boundary between safety and danger. Doors were bolted, shutters were closed. Iron charms were hung above doorways to keep spirits away. Families gathered close, not simply for warmth but for protection. Night was a territory where humans did not fully belong. Inside homes, the hearth remained alive even after dinner. Its fading glow served as the guardian of the household. Parents taught children that as long as the fire still had breath, so did their protection. A dying fire, however, was a symbol of vulnerability. Some kept coals buried under ash to preserve a spark, a small insurance policy against the unknown. For wealthier households, the night looked different. Their bedrooms, if they had bedrooms at all, were layered with draperies, tapestries, and thick curtains around the bed. These were not luxuries, they were shields. The belief lingered that drafts could cause illness, that cold air was a messenger of death, and that darkness creeping through the cracks could invite spirits. Even nobles feared what the night held. Their beds were elevated, enclosed, sometimes latched from the inside. Privacy was rare during the day, but at night it was demanded. Night was a powerful equalizer. No matter how rich or poor you were, darkness erased the lines that separated you from fear. As people settled in after their first sleet, the world outside their walls took on a life of its own. Animals stirred in barns, cats hunted rodents, foxes prowled along fences, wolves howled from forests, their cries echoing through valleys and bouncing off stone chapels. Travelers avoided the roads, but if they had no choice, they prayed aloud as they walked, their voices trembling with each step. Midnight in the medieval world had a strange duality. It was a time for quiet, yet also a time when life awakened. Those who practiced night trade spake as preparing dough. Watchmen patrolling the streets, priests praying. Nocturnal hours moved through the darkness with caution. They believed these hours belonged to forces beyond human understanding, and many believed the night was a time when curses were cast, when witches gathered at crossroads, when spirits visited the sleeping, when the souls of the dead wandered freely between worlds. This was not superstition to them, it was reality woven into the fabric of their lives. Sleep was not merely rest, it was a journey. Inside the home, especially during winter, families shared beds or slept side by side on the floor. The closer they were, the warmer they stayed. A single blanket might cover 4 or 5 people. In some households, children slept at the foot of the parents' bed, in others, servants slept near their masters. Privacy was a luxury of modern invention, but despite their fears, people found comfort in the night as well. It was the only time some had to reflect, pray, whisper stories, or speak of dreams. Evening prayers became intimate exchanges between family members. Couples often spoke quietly during the second sleep, discussing worries, hopes, or the events of the next day. The night created a rare intimacy that daylight never allowed, and in the stillness between first and second sleep, the night felt almost sacred. Candle flames softened hearth, embers pulsed slowly. The darkness pressed in close, but not always with menace. Sometimes it wrapped the home like a cloak, shielding its inhabitants from the world outside. The medieval night demanded respect and demanded caution, but it also offered something the people of that time cherished deep in moments of closeness, introspection, and connection that could not be found in the chaos of daylight. By the final hours before dawn, the world began shifting again. Voices quieted. Superstitions loosened their grip. People drifted into their second sleep, trusting that the night had spared them once more. And as the first glow of morning crept across the sky, they woke with a sense of relief, not just because the day had returned, but because they had survived the night. The medieval night was never empty. It was alive, rich with meaning, fear, warmth, and mystery. 2. Sleep in its presence was not simple. Rest, it was participation in a world that never fully belonged to humans, yet shaped every part of their lives. Medieval nights were alive, sometimes comforting, often terrifying, always unpredictable. People did not sleep in silence. In the medieval night, darkness wasn't just the absence of light, it was a presence of force, something people respected, feared, and adapted to. When the sun went down, the world changed into something almost unrecognizable. Inside homes, the sounds began immediately. Families sharing a single room meant sleep was a communal experience. Parents whispered, infants cried, dogs shuffled, chickens occasionally fluttered from their roost, and older relatives snored loudly beside the fire. Privacy was a luxury no one had. Intimacy, arguments, lullabies, prayers, everything happened within the same few square feet. If someone rolled over or coughed, everyone knew. Outside, the word was even louder. Wolves howled at the edges of villages. Foxes shrieked. Owls screamed in tones that many villagers believed were omens of death. The wind pushed against wooden shutters that rattled like bones. Traveling merchants described the night forests as alive with voices, and for good reason. Every snap of a twig sounded like a thief. Every distant footstep could be a bandit, a spirit, or a neighbor stumbling home from the alehouse. Cities were even noisier. Medieval towns had no noise regulations, no insulation, and no police patrols in the modern sense. Streets echoed with clattering carts, drunken singing, late-night arguments, and the clanging of watchmen ringing bells to mark the passing hours. Cats fought under windows, rats scurried across rooftops. Vendors dumped wastewater into alleys, splashing anyone unlucky enough to be walking below. Monks relied on bells to structure their prayer cycles, but towns near monasteries had no choice but to share that schedule. A bell at midnight meant matins. A bell at 3 a.m. meant woods. Villagers learned to live with the constant tolling because the church dictated the rhythm of time itself. But the greatest disturbance wasn't noise. It was fear. Medieval people believed the night belonged to forces beyond human control. Demons, witches, restless spirits, and creatures that thrived in darkness were part of daily reality. Many slept with charms under their pillows, iron nails, carved crosses, herbs like rosemary or basil. Others hung amulets above their beds to scare away nightmares, which they saw not as dreams but as literal night spirits pressing on their chests. Doors were barred with heavy wooden beams, not just for safety, but spiritually. A poorly secured door wasn't just an invitation to thieves, it invited evil itself. Sleep paralysis, something we understand medically today, was blamed on night demons. People who woke unable to move swore they were being sat on by witches or drained by wandering spirits. Stories of the nightmare, the origin of the word nightmare, described a creature that entered homes and suffocated sleepers with terrifying illusions. Because of these fears, sleep was often communal for emotional safety. Sharing a room meant sharing courage. A whispered prayer from a mother reassured a child. A fire crackling beside the bed cast just enough light to remind everyone that the darkness outside was held at bay. In wealthier homes, the night had its own rituals. Servants moved quietly through hallways carrying small lamps. Guards patrolled the grounds with torches. Large estates employed night watchers whose entire job was to stay awake, listen for danger, and wake the household if anything seemed off. Even royalty feared the night. Women who spent their days cooking, cleaning, and tending children found a moment of silence. Monks described night prayer as the purest form of devotion, untouched by the distractions of daylight. Even ordinary people sometimes found the dark beautiful. Moonlight on thatched roofs, stars visible without pollution, the crackle of a fire, a spouse breathing softly beside them, a moment to reflect without interruption. But that peacefulness never lasted long. A rooster crowed early. The bell rang again. The village dogs barked at shadows. Someone shifted in the shared bed. The night reminded everyone that sleep was temporary, and dawn always returned with work waiting. The medieval night was not silent. It was alive, chaotic, unsettling, and human. A world where sleep happened in fragments, between fears and prayers, in a dance of darkness and survival. The night as a marketplace of secrets. Night in the Middle Ages was not simply a time for rest. It was a marketplace, a whisper market, where secrets, fears, sins, and hopes were traded in the dark. People believed the night had its own economy. Things had different value once the sun went down. A threat whispered at noon meant nothing. The same threat whispered at midnight could shatter a family. A confession spoken in daylight felt like gossip. At night it became a sin. Even promises carried more weight in darkness. Lovers trusted the moon more than priests. Thieves trusted shadows more than partners. And entire villages trusted that daylight would forgive whatever they did after sunset. The medieval mind believed that secrets were heavier at night. This is why people warned their children never to speak their full name after dusk. Never to mention the name of someone who had died recently. Never to describe a nightmare out loud until the sun rose. Words could travel through the dark, they believed, and once spoken, the night would carry them to places you didn't want them to go. Inside homes, beds were confession chambers. Husbands and wives said things at night they would never say in the morning. People cried more quietly after sundown. They prayed more intensely. They regretted more honestly. The darkness softened their pride, and for a few hours, they let go of the stiff backbone they carried all day. The poor whispered across shared straw mattresses, making plans they didn't dare voice at dawn. Plans to leave a harsh employer, plans to hide food during famine, plans to run away from debts, marriages, or responsibilities. And I gave them courage. Reality couldn't. The wealthy had their own version of nighttime commerce. Their beds, closed behind heavy curtains, became private courts where political marriages were negotiated, alliances strengthened, and rivalries soothed. Secrets traded in noble bedchambers could topple a lineage. A whispered insult could spark a feud lasting decades. A whispered promise could save a kingdom. but nothing left the room, or at least nothing was supposed to. Servants, of course, heard everything. A medieval household was thin-walled and thick with gossip. Chambermaids and valets carried more political power than they realized. They slept in corners, on pallets, behind curtains, beside doors, and they listened. Every whispered argument, every suspicious sound, every half-spoken confession became currency. They traded these secrets among themselves, passed them between households, and sometimes whispered them to priests during confession. The church knew far more about noble families than any official record. The night was also the safest time for healing. Midwives visited homes in darkness, bringing herbs and whispered advice. The sick were tended quietly, with only an oil lamp burning. Medieval people believed that illness was embarrassed by daylight and more likely to reveal its true nature at night. Physicians, such as they were, often inspected the color of a patient's breath or the sound of their coughing only after sunset. They said the night made the truth visible. Dreams, too, were traded like messages from another world. People believed dreams weren't personal, they were warnings, omens, or instructions. A dream about water meant danger. A dream about fire meant change. A dream about teeth falling out meant death. Every family had someone who read dreams, turning them into advice or prophecy. Entire decisions, marriages, harvests, journeys were made based on what someone dreamed at night. Even silence had value. A man who slept soundly was trusted. A man who tossed and mumbled was suspected. People were judged by how they slept. If you thrashed at night, perhaps you had a guilty conscience. If you lay still as stone, perhaps you were protected by angels. And if you woke screaming, people wondered what was trying to visit you. Night shaped reputations, carved fears, sparked rumors, strengthened families, destroyed them. It was more than hours of darkness. It was a world of its own, with rules no one questioned. Because medieval people understood one truth we've forgotten. In the dark, the human mind becomes honest, sometimes painfully so. Night was not just when they slept. It was when they truly lived. The nightmares that shaped the medieval mind's sleep in the Middle Ages was never just sleep. It was a vulnerable crossing between the waking world and the realm people believed belonged to spirits, demons, and wandering souls. Nightmares were not just bad dreams, they were warnings, punishments, or signs of divine intervention. And every medieval household carried its own rituals, superstitions, and beliefs to navigate the dark hours. People believed the night was a battlefield where unseen forces roamed freely. The walls of a home could block thieves, wind, or cold, but they could not block what they imagined lurked in the darkness. When someone woke up screaming in the middle of the night, the explanation was simple. An evil spirit had sat on their chest and stolen their breath. Today the experience is known as sleep paralysis, but in the medieval world, it had a name: the nightmare. Not a horse, but a malicious presence, a being that climbed onto sleeping bodies and suffocated them with invisible weight. The fear of the nightmare shaped bedtime rituals across Europe. People placed iron objects beside their bedskis, knives, even horseshoes, believing iron repelled dark creatures. Some slept with herbs tucked beneath their pillows, rosemary to protect dreams, lavender to calm the spirit, St. John's wort to keep demons away. Candles were blown out carefully, not just to prevent fire, but to avoid attracting shadows that might slip inside once the flame died. Every action reflected an effort to create a boundary between themselves and whatever waited in the night. Dreams were taken seriously, interpreted as messages from ancestors or warnings from the divine. A mundane dream could be dismissed, but a vivid or frightening one could change a family's decisions for weeks. A dream about falling meant misfortune. A dream about water meant change. A dream about death was a sign to pray. People discussed their dreams at breakfast the way modern people discuss news: part curiosity, part fear, part survival strategy. Dreams were maps, and ignoring them felt dangerous. Priests became unofficial dream interpreters, though many privately feared the dream world as much as the people they guided. Churches taught that dreams could be temptations from the devil, illusions sent to mislead the faithful. Yet the same churches also emphasized divine visions. For every dream considered holy, another was dismissed as demonic trickery. The boundary between the two was thin, and no one felt fully confident they could tell the difference. The fear of nightmares influenced how people arranged their homes. Beds were pushed close to walls, limiting the angles from which spirits could approach. Children slept near parents for spiritual safety as much as warmth. Families hung religious icons over their beds: the Virgin Mary, local saints, protective charms carved from wood or bone. These were not decorations, they were shields. The bed was not private space, it was a defensive position. Some communities believed nightmares were caused by witches who traveled at night in spirit form. If a person experienced repeated bad dreams, neighbors might whisper that someone nearby was visiting their home invisibly, tormenting them out of jealousy or revenge. This fear could ruin reputations, marriages, even livelihoods. A single nightmare could ignite tensions within a village already stretched thin by poverty, disease, and harsh winters. Medicine offered little comfort. Physicians of the time believed nightmares were caused by imbalances of the body's humors, especially an excess of black bile. They recommended changes in diet or sleeping position. Avoid cheese, avoid beans, avoid sleeping on your back, avoid going to bed with a heavy stomach. Most advice was guesswork, a blend of ancient theories and personal superstition. Yet people followed it because everyone feared the same thing. Waking in darkness with a weight on their chest, unable to move, unable to breathe, unable to tell whether the threat was dream or reality. Storytelling amplified the fear. Around fireplaces, families shared tales of travelers who vanished after sleeping alone in forests, or shepherds who claimed they saw creatures crouching by their beds, waiting for the night to grow darker. Children grew up believing the night was alive. Adults never fully let go of that belief. Even those who mocked superstition would leave a candle burning during storms or whisper a prayer before sleep. Fear was woven into the culture. And yet, in an era without electric lights, insomnia was rare. People fell asleep exhausted from physical labor. Their bodies demanded rest, but their minds entered the night cautiously. Sleep was a necessity, but also a risk. The medieval world embraced this contradiction, turning sleep into a ritual of protection, a negotiation with forces they could neither see nor understand. Every night was a reminder that the world was larger and stranger than daylight allowed. And every morning was a small triumph, a sign that whatever haunted the darkness had chosen to let them wake.